Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, it's Zoe. Have you ever been paralyzed by fear? Has fear ever stopped you from taking radical action like giving feedback to your boss or asking someone else out on a date or speaking up for yourself or sharing your opinion or doing anything that involved taking a risk? Well, chances are you have because you're a human. All humans experience fear. It keeps us from not being dead. So says our guest today. And her name is Dr. Amy Silver. She has a whole alphabet after her name. She's a clinical psychologist. She's got an MA, a BSc, and a number of different things. She's a psychologist, a speaker, and an author. She specializes on the management of our emotions for high performance through courage and courageous conversations. She's the founder of the Courage Club. And her latest book, The Loudest Guest, How to Control and Change Your Relationship with Fear, is the topic of our conversation today. I met Amy ages ago. She's been on the podcast previously. I've had her as a guest speaker at the Edge of Leadership on conference a few years ago. She is an awesome human. I love her company, and you're going to love this interview. Before we get started, a quick reminder. If you are a CEO, a managing director, or a senior executive, and you're keen to have more influence and impact, then please do consider joining us in Amplifiers. Amplifiers is our advanced leadership program for senior leaders who are ready to step up, move through fear, and make a bigger impact. So we're about creating bigger impact and more influence. If that's you, and you want to play with a group of like-minded peers from wherever you are in Australia or around the world, then we have a great program for you. Just head on over to zoerouth.com, click on programs, and you'll find Amplifiers right there. Hope to see you there. In the meantime, let's get on with the interview. I start this podcast laughing. We were just having a giggle. Welcome to the show, Dr. Amy Silver.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for having me.
You are a repeat customer. You did appear on the show a couple of years back after or just before coming and presenting at the Edge of Leadership on conference here in Canberra. So I'm a fan of your work. I'm a fan of you. And it's a delight to have you here with your latest book, The Loudest Guest. How exciting.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this. So I could talk about this for a lot of hours. So you're going to have to keep me to time.
Oh, definitely. Nobody wants to listen to us rabble on and for hours and hours. But The Loudest Guest, right? So it's all about fear. Why did you call this book The Loudest Guest? And why is fear a guest at all?
Okay, so I called it The Loudest Guest because the whole book is really trying to change our relationship with fear. So fear is one of those emotions that we try to push aside. We don't really like it. It doesn't leave us feeling very positive, and it can be quite overwhelming. So a lot of the time we actually fear itself, or we try to deny it, or we feel ashamed of it. And I really believe that we can change our relationship with fear if we start to see it as one of the many visitors that we host in our brain, and rather than something that we need to... Wait a minute.
What do you mean visitors in my brain?
You don't have visitors?
Oh, God. Well, I might.
Okay, so my brain, I almost imagine it like a party, right? And there is a lot of different emotions that are part of my party, and I see them almost like people. You know, there's the guest of fear, there's a guest of sadness, there's a guest of joy, there's a guest of pride, love, excitement. There's all these different guests that I can call on, and I think if we can change our relationship with emotions so that they become things that we can call on, we can choose when we tune into them and when we don't. We are not out of control of our emotions. Our emotions can be very loud. but we are the host of that party, not any one of our guests. And if we can see them as guests, as honoured guests, we can start to tune into what they give us, the positives that they give us, and accept that they are here for the ride. They're coming along to my party, whether I want them to or not. So let me use it. Let me tune in to understand, what does fear want for me? How is it helping me? Where does it hinder me? Where does it stop me being maybe as good as I could be, or as useful as I could be, or as big as I could be? Where does it help and where does it hinder? But I can't do that if I haven't got a relationship with it. So to go back to your question about why I called it The Loudest Guest, it's because I want us all to have this better relationship with fear so that we can use it, honour it, and remember that it is a guest of mine. I am the host. It doesn't control me. I control it.
Oh, you control your guests? Well, that's a better dinner party than I've experienced.
Well, some of them do get very loud. And so that's how we need to move into this position of understanding how to control it. And I don't think we get taught that. I definitely think that is a lesson that we sometimes learn as we go through life. But you and I know that it only takes us being in a group setting with other people pushing our buttons for those emotions to take the front end of what we do, and we lose control. That emotion decides the actions, and that's when we can lash out, we can be churlish, we can block somebody from speaking, we can deny someone the airtime, or we can pull back, we can start avoiding things, we can be really cautious and overthinking. And all of those behaviors is really what I see, that's the fight and flight response that fear wants us to take. And so learning how to manage those responses that fear wants us to have is really key in us being a grown-up and being adult and learning how to self-lead. And from that place of self-leadership comes our capability to develop others.
Okay, so we've got a party going on in our head, and I'm trying to just think about what kind of party. Is it a dance party? Is it a dinner party?
Mine's very sophisticated. Yes, there's lots of champagne flowing and soft jazz music and very sophisticated. Yeah.
I was going for a disco party. I think that would be a fun kind of disco party. So learning how to dance with fear. Here's where I'm going to work this metaphor, Amy. Learning how to dance with fear. What's their two-step that they're good at? Maybe they do the popcorn. I think I'm going to get derailed by this metaphor
by your dances.
After I decide to lead it. So obviously the premise is that we have these guests, these emotions in our experience, and they can be of service to us. They can also be derailers, like you just described how fear can make us show up in ways that aren't that useful in our relationships, that make us problematic to be around and be with. So what the hell is useful about fear?
Okay, well, first and foremost, without it, we would be dead. So a good emotion to have.
That's good use.
That's a
Stop
good
us
use.
being dead, okay.
Stop us being dead. So, look, fear is, it is the primary emotion. So we are, as humans, fear-seeking machines. We are programmed, our brain is designed to seek things which are risky, because without being aware of what the risks are, we could be... Well, obviously, in its most primal sense, it's sort of not walking towards the saber-toothed tiger. But in our current format, it's about not being excluded from the tribe. It's about not doing things that would cause us harm. It's about being valued. And it's there as a seeking threat for us to understand what the risks are so that we can prepare ourselves and monitor and reduce the risk of failing, or reduce the risk of being excluded, or reduce the risk of being hurt. So it is the very thing that keeps us in tune with what could be our best self. So working super hard, heading into challenges that are slightly out of our comfort zone. It warns us when we are getting close to that discomfort space, and it's also very closely aligned with excitement. So the physical sensations of excitement are exactly the same as the physical sensations of fear. There is literally no difference in the body from those two experiences.
That's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something could eat you and that could be exciting. It could be interpreted as exciting.
You might get into the pain world somewhere, but it's that thrill. And that's why we love roller coasters and being out in the wild and being connected with those danger moments, because on the other side of that rush is the relief and the adrenaline and all the oxytocin that comes kind of once we've been triggered. So there are heaps of ways in which fear...
Hang on a sec. Oxytocin comes on the other side of fear?
Yeah.
So you got adrenaline, cortisol, and let me just check that I've understood this correctly. So you get fear, cortisol, and some other biochemicals prodded into being when you have a fear response. And then when you ascertain that the fear is not a threat, you get a release of oxytocin.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And so in a really mild format, that's sort of what trust is, right? So when you trust another person, you're taking a risk, right? And the risk is that you're going to get let down or hurt, or that it's going to fail in some way. And on the other side of that risk is love and connection and deep sort of, connection. So, and that is oxytocin. So it's a beautiful chemical thing that we can use for good. It is definitely, though, something that if we become unfamiliar with channeling it or understanding how to use it, it can be incredibly overwhelming and can lead to paralysis, where we really just stay still. So the fight, flight, or play dead response is a very real chemical and biological and evolutionary. It's there for purpose, but in our current context, and particularly at work, it just blocks us in so many ways, and it blocks our connection, it blocks our agility, it blocks our trust, it blocks our communication, it creates silos and prevents us from moving forward with diversity, with inclusion, with pretty much everything. And I find it really, obviously it is very much my leaning, and where I started with you and what we were talking about last time that I was on the podcast was communication. I find it everywhere. I see it everywhere. I see most communication blocks, if not all, really relating to fear and mismanagement of the fear response that we each have for our own individual reasons. But we're also aligned on the response that we have to fear. We really don't have many options other than play dead, react in a defensive way or an attacking way, or avoiding. That's what our body wants us to do. That's what fear wants us to do. All
right. So how do we learn how to dance with fear? So it's got some good sides, keeps us being dead.
That's good. Tick.
On the other side, when we face it down or process it, which you can tell us how to do in just a second, we've got love and trust and all these lovely things. So there is an upswing, and it gives us excitement potentially. So how do we dance with it? How do we learn to process the emotion of fear?
So the very first stages, and in the book I talk about these 6 stages, but the very first process is to understand, where is fear showing up? So one of the really interesting things that I found with the book, and you know what it's like, you write the book and then people read it and then they tell you where this is relevant to them, and you see it and you hear about it in through a slightly different lens from what you knew about it when you wrote it. So I'm finding that really interesting. But a lot of people are reading the book and kind of going, wow, I did not realize how much control my fear had. And people who are at first identifying with the content are people who notice that they are anxious, or that they have an inner critic, or that they are stuck in doubt, or they don't believe in themselves enough, or they're not speaking up in meetings, or they would like to be better at presenting, or that sort of style. But the people who didn't realize how much fear was involved in their world are the people who are irritable, defensive, find it difficult to trust, find it difficult to create strong connections at work, people who are suspicious or people who are trying to lead in a more compassionate way. So it's really trying to, the first stage anyway, is really trying to identify, where does fear get in my way? Where is it taking control of me rather than me taking control of it? So recognition is the first step. And then very quickly, trying to stay in self-compassion. So rather than feeling ashamed of your fear or feeling unusual that you've got this fear, or blocking it, or feeling guilty, or feeling like you don't want to talk about the way that fear is getting in your way, we want to stay in self-compassion so that we can understand this is a human emotion. This is part of the human experience. There is nothing to feel ashamed here. You don't need to fear fear. It can't hurt you if you open up to it. You know, it's when we sort of place that dam. I always think of like a water dam. You know, you're placing a dam, and then the emotion sort of builds up behind it, and then it becomes very overwhelming. But if we actually turn towards it with compassion and kind of go, I know why you're here. You're trying to protect me. Thanks for coming to the party. That self-compassion piece, I think, is really important. And then from that position, we can actually sit down and have a conversation with it and try and evaluate what it's doing, how it's talking to you. And I really like this personification piece of kind of giving it a character, you know, and being able to sit down with it and kind of go, all right, I know what you're trying to help me identify a risk here. What is the actual message that you're giving me, so that we can sort of strip down the drama that it uses. Or often fear will use stories, either that it's heard or stories from your past, or you'll have a memory. I mean, I know when I was writing the book, I actually had all these memories of, you know, school days at times when I was sort of like, you know, my fear voice pulls on these embarrassing moments of my life or things that happened, and they're still so front and center of my memory. You know, I still have them burned in my brain, and fear just grabs it like it's grabbing something from the filing cabinet and just chucking it in front of me in my now. But that's just a tool that fear is using. That's not actually what is happening now. So we want to get into a position where we can evaluate what the fear voice is, hear the message, and then choose deliberately what way we want to go. And sometimes that way we want to go is not doing what fear wants us to do. So fear wants us to pull back or arc up. And what we want to do might be to serve our longer term goal. So rather than keeping us safe in the moment, heading towards something that's slightly uncomfortable, but we're in control. And so then the last stages the cycle kind of talks through is moving into that experimentation phase and going, okay, how do I inch forward with my goal, which may aggravate the fear voice, which may mean that I have to move into discomfort. What are the steps that I can take that feel safe enough and I can deliberately be in control of that? And I talk about in the book something called a hierarchy experiment, where you literally kind of create these steps that you are deliberately doing so that you are building that muscle of courage, working towards your goal, sitting with the discomfort, but moving through it and learning yourself that you don't need to listen to your fear voice all the time. You don't need to do what your fear voice tells you to do. You can move forward through discomfort, and you can hold yourself safely through it, so that when the opportunity, I always think about like if somebody's doing a presentation or something and they don't want to do presentations, and the opportunity comes up for them to present, and if you haven't done that hierarchy of making yourself comfortable with that discomfort, you've really got nowhere to go. You've either got to avoid it or blame someone else for putting you in that position or whatever it is. Whereas if you've kind of put this as a deliberate goal, you can feel more in control of growing that skill rather than it just sort of landing in your lap. So the experimentation bit, I think, is the bit that most of us need to really focus on once we understand where and how it relates to our longer term goals.
Yeah, I think that's lovely, the experimentation piece. So it's the awareness, knowing why it's there, understanding what it's trying to do for you, and going, right, okay, so with all of that, what choice do I then choose to respond instead of react? I want to get your opinion on something I learned from Tim Ferriss, who probably learned it from someone else, where he talks about fear setting. Have you heard of fear setting?
Yes, but you explain it. Yeah, yes.
Okay. According to Tim, he does this on a regular basis. He does goal setting, like this is what I want to achieve, but he also goes fear setting, which is essentially looking at what is the worst possible thing that could happen should I proceed with these goals. And it's the equivalent of doing a pre-mortem or of a red team kind of experience where you look at, right, if it all goes pear-shaped, how would I handle it? And the Navy SEALs do it as well. So whenever they're planning a mission, they look at all the possible things that could go wrong. They look at what if a bad guy comes in from that angle. And they do mental rehearsals for all these bad things. And then they've programmed their brain to automatically respond should one of those things happen. And in fear setting in particular, it's about leaning really hard into the feeling that you might get if the bad thing happens. So I was talking to a client recently about something similar, and I was giving the example, like one of my fears sits there. It's like, what if, actually, I don't even speak it aloud because it's so, I don't want it to bring it to life. Let me just choose a different example. Okay, so what if someone you cared about passed away? Like no one wants to grieve. Like it's I think grief is similar to fear in that it just feels horrible. And so you avoid thinking about it until it's a dam that bursts. What if you leaned into that and really explored that? Or, you know, what if your spouse left you? Like maybe that's your worst fear. And how would you handle that? And you kind of lean into the fear and the horrible feeling and then have a think about how you might actually move through that and take the next steps. What do you think about that as a process for dancing with fear?
I think it's worth exploring. And, you know, if you don't do that, have a play because it will, whether it's useful or not, will depend on a whole lot of what your core beliefs are. It comes from the cognitive behavioral world where the premise of it is to work out whether some of your catastrophizing is just that. Is it catastrophizing? So one of the tools in cognitive behavioral therapy is that you would keep saying, so what's so bad about that? You know, so here's your fear. And so what's so bad about that? And you just keep doing that. And what's so bad about that until you get to the bottom, which is the fear that, you know, is really driving this. Now, usually that fear is things like, I'll be on my own forever, you know, or, you know, it proves that I am unlovable, or I'll be dead, or whatever. Now, and we each have a different version of that. And so how far you go with that is, you know, it's a technique. But even in CBT, you know, so say that the last what's so bad about that was I'll be dead, you know, I'll die. You know, you would still as a therapist say, and what's so bad about that? So it really kind of tries to take you as far as you can with your relationship with fear. Like really, what is the end point here? So that we don't need to be so frightened of it. Because if I was dead, well, I'd be dead. Like I'm not going to be, it's not so bad because I'll be dead, you know, like, so it's sort of.
I wouldn't be feeling anything at that point.
I wouldn't be feeling anything. So, and that's the purpose of it, is that it brings you full circle into, well, I guess it's actually not that bad. You know, I'd be okay on my own. I'd be able to survive, or whatever the core belief is. So that's a CBT tool and technique to really deep dive into the thing that you're fearing is probably not as frightening as you think that it is. There is a problem with it, though, in that it does tend to be one of the, it's almost like it's the technique that a lot of us use when we worry, where we kind of try to predict all the bad things that could happen. And worry in itself is a really unhelpful thing for our brain to do. It really does not provide any value at all. So problem solving is one thing, but worrying, when we are looping round in a ruminating way, there is actually zero benefit to worry cognitively. Zero. It's just a mental loop that we get caught in. And so when we worry about things that we actually have got no control over or no way of predicting, it's eating energy from our brain and it's not providing us with any value at all. So if you are a worrier, going down that track of kind of, you know, going on that fear journey really deeply probably won't serve you as well. So it's a tool that people use. It needs to be experimented with like all tools and see if it's got any value to it. But I certainly think that there is value of getting closer to understanding what is the fear voice saying. So, for example, if it's saying to you, if you reveal that you don't know what you're doing with this task, or if you reveal that you don't understand something, what fear will be saying to you is you will look like a failure. Everybody will know that you're a fake. You have got no leg to stand on. Everyone will realise that you've been faking it all this time and you've got nothing. It'll come in with all that sort of dialogue. Now, it's worth writing that down. Like, what is the fear voice actually saying to me? Because then again, you've got that perspective. And so I recommend to people that you grab a book. On one side of the page, you write what the fear voice is telling me. And on the other side of the book, on the page next to it, you write, what do I think? And so you try and gain that separation between what the fear voice is saying to me and what I believe. And that separation of the fear voice from me, or, the guest from the host, is absolutely essential. Because if you can't hear what the voice is saying, you can't see what value it has, and you can't evaluate, whether it's being helpful or not. So I definitely recommend having a conversation with your fear and tracking the way that it's talking to you, whether it's being helpful or unhelpful, guiding or unguiding, catastrophizing or balanced. What is it actually saying? And again, you may actually find that when you do that process, you can hear that voice, and it's a person that you know from your history. And again, worthy of kind of going, well, what am I carrying that guest around with me? I never liked them anyway.
You were not invited to the party. Get lost.
So yes, I think anything that gives you a perspective on your fear voice being a voice, a guest, and one that requires evaluating. Your fear voice is not you. You are not your voices.
Okay. So what I like about your distinction around those two different approaches is the fear setting process, the CBT process, doesn't really give you much distance from the emotion. Basically, it's doing a dress rehearsal of it and taking it down its little rabbit hole.
Yeah, and it can be really good, because you can go, and it definitely sort of say, well, you can get really stuck with some of your thoughts and, really kind of going, and so what? So what if that came true? Well, I would do X, Y, and Z. Great. It's a problem-solving tool. It's very different from worrying, which is trying to do the same or disguising itself as doing the same. If I think about all the things that I would do if that person died, and I get stuck on it, I get stuck in the loop, not helpful. So as long as it stays within problem solving, it's a useful tool.
Thank you. That's fabulous. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to talking about fear in relationship to developing others. So I'm thinking about listeners to the podcast who are leaders and they have a team. Where does fear show up in that setting? And what can leaders do to diminish, reduce, deal with the fear that may exist? So a two-pronged question. How does fear show up in that setting, and what can leaders do about it?
Okay, so where it shows up for all of us in any group setting, but really particularly highlighted at work because of our relationship with work and self-esteem and feeling of value and our identity, it's also wrapped up at work, so it really does trigger a lot of our sense of belonging and purpose, and all sorts of things happen in a group setting through work. Where it shows up is in this concept of psychological safety, which I've probably taught you about before, and I know you know a lot about it as well, around the idea of how safe everybody feels to say what they think, to be who they are, to try new things, to ask questions, to come out of hierarchy and to trust, to create connections. All of those things rely on this concept of psychological safety. We all have a screener that is there because we're risk-seeking machines to evaluate how safe am I in this group. And if I don't feel safe enough to question, to change, to take risks, I am not going to be bringing the best of me to work. So this is where we get groupthink, we get dominating people, we get missed ideas, we get increased risk because people don't point out mistakes, we get wasted conversations, wasted time. So in a team context, not feeling safe is, and you know this, but there was a big study by Google that showed that it was the number one driver for high performing teams was a team that felt safe. From a leader perspective, what that means is that there are a couple of things that have to happen to make a team feel safer. One is that the leader needs to encourage an environment where risk and failure and comfortable with vulnerability and all the things that you talk about, that needs to be really present. And that can happen through role modeling, and it can happen through providing the context for people that allow them to explore what created this failure in a non-judgy way, or let's try and do this, let's move into this area, let's try and explore this, or how do we become more diverse, or how do we become in our thinking, or whatever the questions are. So setting up some routines that allow the actual environment to become more playful and more explorative, and less driven by the system of hierarchies that we've all kind of identified with at work, and where we all conform to what the leader wants or what we think the leader wants. And the other thing is just to work on everyone's courage. So people being really capable of standing in their own power, understanding how to manage their fear. And so I think that there's two things to do for leaders. One is to role model and create the environment, and the other is to create more courage for everybody, which is an individual thing that we're all working on. And of course we're all working on it because it's an innate human response. So when I do the cultural programs, I work with everybody using courage. We help everybody move up in terms of their courage and their being able to move beyond fear so that it doesn't control them. And the leaders go through a separate program, which is really much more about how do you create safe environments? How do you lead with vulnerability and strength, but allowing for people to have that space to risk?
So I'm curious around that then. You know, if we're all working on courage, and I'm certainly thinking, yeah, I'm working on courage in a number of different places. What kind of courage things are you working on?
It's terrifying being so close to my fear, I tell you. I feel like I've got a really good relationship with my fear, like I really understand it. And, you know, that brings with it a whole host of times where I just cannot ignore it. You know, I know that it's there. I know that it's blocking me. And I'm just in this sort of negotiation game. I really like, you know, some strategies that I've come up with personally. And again, I know that you're a big fan of this, is moving faster than my fear wants me to move, as a sort of, you know, I kind of see fear and it shows up, I get it, and I almost now have got to a stage where I go, okay, and so I have to move in that direction. It's not even, it's because I do not want to be controlled by fear. I just feel really strongly that if fear shows up, I want to explore it and I want to use it as a way of guiding me towards growth and towards a bigger life. And so there are a couple of things that I am very comfortable being small in, like my fears around spiders and cockroaches and stuff. I'm very happy to ignore those fears and stay very comfortable there. But anything to do with personal development, I find it really hard to see a fear and then not do anything about it. Like I actually just keep going for it. And now I have a really healthy relationship with fear. I feel it just as much as I have always. And, you know, I think if you're lucky, it will always be there. You know, it will always be there to help guide you towards a bigger life. And I think if you can use it as a guide rather than as something to feel ashamed of or something to walk away from, that's a good place to be.
You just said something fabulous. You know, fear is there to guide you to a bigger life. And I just wanted to just stop and go, wow, that's really, really cool. If listening to this, that's all you take away from this conversation, I think that's time well spent. Yeah, I think that's lovely, you know, because fear it's there to keep you safe and contained and not dead.
And not dead. That's good.
But sometimes on the other side of that is growth and a bigger life. I think that's lovely. Like one of the things that I'm leaning into is I'm writing a novel this year. I've never written a novel. It feels really uncomfortable. I don't know if it's any good, all that kind of self-doubt stuff that you get when you're doing something for the very first time. It's all sitting there and I'm like, dancing. I'm playing a little disco dance with fear around that.
and look at you doing it, you're doing it. You're not stopping. So I think, it's a thing that I don't expect to ever be fearless. Like I never, ever, ever want to be fearless. I want to be full of just as much fear as I have always been. But I want to be living a constantly bigger life. So, it's with me for the journey. It's there to guide me. I know what it's trying to do, and I'm very grateful, and I have control over it.
Oh my God, that was just beautiful. Dr. Amy Silver. Dr. Amy Silver, which I just love your name. It's just awesome. Where can people find out more about you and your book?
The book is everywhere. It's on Amazon and Booktopia and on my website and everywhere. And it should still be in bookshops, I hope. So,
DrAmySilver.com is your website?
Yes. Thank you, Zoe. And Instagram and all the rest of it, all the socials.
Of course. Good job. Amy, it's just been a pleasure talking with you. I love this topic. I love your work. I love you. You're great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
There's nothing better than that quote. Fear can help us lead a bigger life. I absolutely love that from Dr. Amy Silver. She is gorgeous. I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I did having the conversation with her. Just a reminder that if you are a CEO, managing director, or senior executive, consider joining us in Amplifiers. We'd love to have you there. We've got an immersion coming up. That's our great big event where if you're in Canberra, you can join us live. If you are international, we have an international virtual group where you can get to meet other like-minded leaders for a deep dive into all things leadership. And our theme for this quarter is leading in complexity. So we'd love to have you there. Just head on over to zoerouth.com, click on programs and find us and in Amplifiers. See you then. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.